The gavel struck the table, and the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Mr. Renato Caldas, you are being charged with embezzlement, misuse of guardianship, and negligence toward minors under your responsibility. How do you plead?" Renato stood still. 63 years old, white hair, hands rough from years of hard work. He looked at the prosecutor the way someone looks at something they do not recognize, not out of fear, but from a genuine, almost painful bewilderment. As if the question had been asked in the wrong language. On the other side of the room, 3 grown men sitting in the front row exchanged glances. None of the 3 said a word. But all 3 clenched their fists at the same time. This happened on an April morning, in Cascavel, in the countryside of Parana. And to understand what was happening in that courtroom, it is necessary to go back 22 years, to a night of heavy rain when Renato Caldas opened the door of his house and found a child sitting on the step, wrapped in a jacket that did not belong to him. Renato was not rich. He never had been. He worked as a mechanic in a small repair shop he had built himself with money borrowed from his brother, and he lived in a 2-story house with 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood that outsiders called that side of town, which, in direct translation, means it was not the nice side. He was 58 years old when he lost his wife, Dona Cecilia, to a cancer that progressed too quickly for any doctor to do anything. It happened in September. And in October, 2 months later, he found Tiago on his doorstep. Tiago was 8 years old. Hollow eyes, unevenly grown hair, a purple bruise on his chin that was not from a fall. Child Protective Services arrived an hour later. They said the family situation was critical, a word that, between the lines, meant violence, alcohol, and a mother who had disappeared without leaving an address. "Is there any family that could take him in temporarily?" the social worker asked. Silence. Renato looked at the boy. The boy looked at Renato. And for some reason he could never properly explain, he said, "You can leave him here." The social worker came back 4 months later with another boy. This one was named Davi. He was 6 years old and did not speak. Not because of a disability, the reports showed that later, but because at some point in life he had learned that speaking attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. Davi spent 3 weeks without saying a single word inside that house. He ate, slept, watched. Until one Saturday morning, while Renato was fixing a faucet under the kitchen sink and quietly cursing because the screwdriver kept slipping, he heard a tiny voice ask, "Can I help?" He hit his head on the sink in surprise. And when he turned around, Davi was standing there, with an expression that mixed fear and something that looked like courage. "You can," Renato said, without making a fuss. Because making a fuss would have scared the boy back into silence. That was in March. In July of the same year, Bruno arrived. Bruno was 12 years old and arrived angry. Angry at everything. At the social worker, at the worn-out backpack he carried, at the mattress in the room he shared with Tiago, at the food Renato made on that first dinner. It was the anger of someone who had been hurt so many times that he had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with care. "I'm not staying here," he said on the first day. "That's fine," Renato replied. "But while you're deciding, dinner's on the table." Bruno stayed. He stayed cursing, knocking things over, testing boundaries as if searching for the moment the other person would explode. But Renato never exploded. He had a patience that was not indifference, it was a choice. Every time a limit was tested, he answered with the same strange calm of someone who had already lost enough in life to know that fighting over little things is a waste. No one around understood why that widower with no obligation whatsoever had taken in 3 children that the system had returned like defective merchandise. Someone in the neighborhood even asked him directly. Renato thought for a second and answered, "Because someone had to." That sentence would resurface in the courtroom 22 years later. Only this time, he would not be the one saying it. If you are enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us in the comments what you thought and which city or country you are watching from. The years inside that house were not easy, but they were real. Renato woke up at 5:30 every morning, opened the repair shop at 7, closed it at 6 in the evening, and still made it home in time to cook dinner. Not because he was Superman, but because 3 children needed to eat, and no one else was going to do that for them. Tiago learned how to work on engines before he learned how to ride a bicycle. He spent Saturday afternoons at the shop beside Renato, holding tools and asking questions that never seemed to end. Davi, the quietest one, discovered that he liked books, and Renato, who had never read much, started going to the public library just to borrow whatever the boy asked for. Bruno remained difficult for quite a while. But there were moments, rare and silent ones, when he sat on the couch beside Renato to watch the news and said nothing, and that nothing between the two of them meant more than any conversation. None of the three were formally adopted right away. The process took years, full of hearings, paperwork, and different social workers who arrived with clipboards and left with reports. But in practice, from the very first month, all three already called that house home. And Renato, even though he never demanded it, ended up becoming a father in a way that no document ever needed to confirm. The problem started when Renato turned 60. It did not happen suddenly. It happened little by little, the way things that truly hurt usually do. Renato's brother was named Gilberto. Younger, more eloquent, with a smile that entered any room before he did. While Renato had built his life through physical labor and silence, Gilberto had done well in business. He sold real estate, knew the right people, frequented places where handshakes were worth more than contracts. The two had never been close after Donna Cecilia died. Gilberto would show up at Christmas, stay for 2 hours, compliment the food, and leave. He never asked about the boys by name. Never asked how Renato was really doing. But when their father died, 2 years before the trial, everything changed. Their father left behind a piece of land. It was not large, but it was located in an area that had greatly increased in value over the past few years, a place construction companies had their eyes on. The land was under both brothers' names, equally shared. And Gilberto wanted to sell it. Renato did not. Not because he was greedy, but because on that land there was a small structure, an old shed that he had renovated with his own hands years earlier, and he had a simple plan, to turn it into a space for vulnerable young people. A modest and concrete extension of everything he had done for the three boys. Gilberto thought the idea was ridiculous. "You're going to waste an asset over sentimentality," he said during a phone call that Davi overheard by accident while visiting Renato one Sunday afternoon. Renato answered calmly. He said it was not sentimentality. That it was a choice. Gilberto hung up. 3 months later, the accusation came. Anonymous, filed with the public prosecutor's office, with details specific enough to seem credible, and vague enough to be difficult to immediately refute. It claimed that Renato Caldas had, over the years, diverted funds intended for the care of the minors under his guardianship, that he had received government assistance and used it for personal purposes, that the boys had lived in inadequate conditions. It was a lie. Every line of it was a lie. But a filed lie carries the same weight as truth in the beginning. And in the beginning, that was enough to open a case. Tiago was the first to find out. He called Davi, who called Bruno, who took the first bus back to Cascavel that very night. The three gathered at Renato's house, the same house as always, with the same faucet Davi had helped fix decades earlier, and found the man sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him and an expression none of the three had ever seen before. It was not despair. It was something worse. It was resignation. "I can get a lawyer," Renato said, without conviction. "We already got one," Bruno replied. Renato looked at the three of them. Davi looked away toward the window, which for anyone who knew him, meant he was holding something back. Tiago had his elbows resting on the table and a stiffness in his jaw that resembled the way he looked as a child when he was angry but trying not to show it. Bruno was standing, leaning against the wall, with a look Renato knew very well. It was the same look from the first day. Only now it was pointed outward, not inward. What Renato still did not know was that the three of them had found something before coming to him. Something that would completely change the course of what was about to happen. But at that moment, none of them said a single word about it. Davi had always been the most methodical of the three. He was not the most talkative, that was Bruno, when he wanted to be. He was not the most skilled with his hands either, that was Tiago, without question. But Davi had a quality the other two recognized without ever needing to name it. He never walked into any situation without first understanding the terrain. Since childhood, before speaking, he observed. Before acting, he thought. And before trusting, he verified. That was why, when the accusation arrived, it was Davi who requested a complete copy of the case file. He worked as a legal analyst at a mid-sized company in Curitiba. He was not a lawyer, but he knew enough about documentation, deadlines, and legal language to understand what he was reading. And what he was reading left him quiet for far too long. Tiago, who was sitting across the table in Davi's apartment that night, noticed. "What is it?" Davi pointed to a date in the document. A specific date, in a report describing alleged improper withdrawals from an account linked to the guardianship of the minors. That date, he said. I know where Renato was that day. Tiago was 30 years old and worked in the same field Renato had worked in his entire life, mechanics, only on a larger scale, at a dealership in Londrina. He had the kind of practical memory that comes from learning by doing. He remembered part numbers, engine models, maintenance dates. And when Davi showed him the date, it took him exactly 4 seconds to remember. It was the day of the highway accident, he said. Renato was stuck in traffic for almost 6 hours. I remember because he called me from the car, complaining about it. I was still in high school. Can you prove it? Tiago thought for a moment. The call record should still exist. And if the accident was reported, the newspaper has the date. Davi opened his laptop. In 40 minutes, they had the record of the highway accident, coverage from 2 local news outlets with date and timestamps, and a screenshot of the call history Tiago had recovered from an old phone backup. Renato was 200 kilometers away at the exact moment when, according to the accusation, he had supposedly made an in-person withdrawal at a bank branch in Cascavel. It was impossible. And impossible, when documented, has another name, a lie. Meanwhile, Bruno was doing something different. He had returned to Cascavel and, over the following days, started talking to people. Not in an obvious way. Bruno had learned early in life that drawing too much attention closes doors. So he was discreet. He had coffee with former neighbors. Met with an old employee from Renato's repair shop who had left years earlier without resentment. Sat at a bakery near Uncle Gilberto's house and simply stayed there for 2 days, watching the movement. It was during one of those afternoons that he saw something he was not looking for. Gilberto leaving a law office with a man Bruno did not know. The two spoke with the familiarity of people who meet often, not like client and lawyer, but like 2 men sharing a common plan. Bruno took a photo without getting up from his chair, using the bakery window's reflection so he would not attract attention. Then he went after the lawyer's name. It took 2 days. But when he found it, he understood everything at once, like staring at a picture for too long and suddenly seeing what had been hidden from the beginning. 3 years earlier, the lawyer had represented a construction company in a land dispute in a neighboring city. The construction company was the same one that had made a formal offer for the land Gilberto wanted to sell. And the lawyer's service agreement with the construction company, which Bruno found in a public court record, contained a success clause. The lawyer would only receive full payment if the sale went through. Gilberto had not hired a lawyer to defend himself from anything. He had hired someone to attack. The 3 met again at Renato's house on a Thursday night. This time, they brought everything printed and organized into folders separated by subject. Renato stared at the material spread across the kitchen table, the same table where he had served dinner to 3 children who had nowhere else to go, and for a moment he said nothing. How long did it take you to do all this? He finally asked. 12 days, said Tiago. Renato ran a hand over his face. He had the habit of doing that whenever he was processing something too big to fit into a single expression. I never asked you to do anything for me, he said. It was not a complaint. It was the honest observation of a man who had spent his entire life built around giving, and who was learning, late in life, what it means to receive. We know, Bruno replied. That's why we did it. The lawyer the 3 had hired would arrive the next morning with a strategy built around everything they had gathered. But there was still one missing piece, and none of the 3 yet knew that it even existed. The hearing began at 9 in the morning. The room had that specific kind of silence found in places where important decisions are made, not an empty silence, but a heavy one, like the air before a storm. Renato sat beside his lawyer, a woman in her 40s named Dr. Isabella Font, who had the kind of calm that does not come from inexperience, but from having been in rooms like that enough times not to be intimidated by their weight. Gilberto was on the other side, with the lawyer Bruno had identified, a man in a dark suit with the posture of someone accustomed to winning. He did not look at Renato when he entered. He glanced quickly at the 3 sons, then looked away. Tiago noticed the avoidance. He said nothing. The prosecutor opened with the original accusation. He read the main points in the monotone voice of someone presenting facts, improper withdrawals, dates, amounts, a narrative built to sound solid. From the outside, to anyone who did not know what lay underneath, it sounded convincing. Dr. Isabella let him finish. She did not interrupt, gesture, or show any reaction. She simply took notes in silence with a blue pen on a sheet no one else could see. When it was her turn, she stood up slowly. The first thing she presented was the record of the highway accident. Not just the newspaper article. She had obtained the official police report, with the start and end times of the roadblock on the highway, signed by the highway patrol. Renato had been stuck in traffic for 6 hours and 40 minutes on the day when, according to the accusation, he had made an in-person withdrawal in Cascavel. The prosecutor asked for a moment to verify the documentation. Gilberto's lawyer remained motionless. Then came the call records, authenticated by the phone company. Tiago had formally requested them, and the company had issued an official document with the date, time, and duration of the calls. Renato had called Tiago at 2:17 p.m. that day from a signal tower located 212 kilometers away from Cascavel. The judge looked at the prosecutor. The prosecutor looked at the papers. "Does the prosecution have any way to contest the defendant's location on that date?" she asked. Silence. That was when Dr. Isabella did something no one in the room expected. She did not move on to the next argument. Instead, she requested permission to present a witness who had not been on the original list, a last-minute inclusion authorized by the judge the day before, after a motion filed with justification of newly discovered relevance. The side door of the room opened. A gray-haired woman entered, wearing thin-framed glasses and carrying a folder of documents under her arm. Her name was Norma Castillo, and she had worked for 11 years as an employee at a bank branch in Cascavel, the same branch mentioned in the accusation. Norma had retired 2 years earlier, and when Davi located her, through a name that appeared in an old banking correspondence record he had requested through the Freedom of Information Act, she did not hesitate to speak. Because Norma had kept something. She had kept it because something about that day had bothered her, and people who work with documents for years develop an instinct for when something is wrong. She handed the folder to Dr. Isabella. Inside was a copy of a handwritten service form from the day of the alleged withdrawal. The form recorded the teller's name, the time, and, according to the bank's internal protocol, a brief description of the customer served. The description did not match Renato at all. Different height, different age, and a handwritten note Norma had made in the margin of the page at the time, without really knowing why. Customer nervous, asked twice if there were cameras at the counter. Dr. Isabella turned to the judge. "We also request the internal security footage from the bank branch for that date." Gilberto's lawyer stood up. "Objection. This material was not notified with sufficient advance." "It was filed 48 hours ago," Dr. Isabella replied without raising her voice. "Within the legal deadline." The judge allowed it. The footage was displayed on a side screen. Old quality, fixed camera, but clear enough. The man standing at the counter that day was not Renato Caldas. He was younger, thinner, and wearing a cap that he removed for just a second, only a second, while picking up the document from the counter. Bruno recognized the face before anyone else in the room. It was one of Gilberto's nephews, the son of a sister who lived in another city. Someone no one would associate with Renato, but whom Gilberto knew well enough to recruit. Gilberto's lawyer requested a suspension of the hearing. The judge denied it. Gilberto looked at Renato for the first time since entering the room. And Renato looked back at him, not with anger, not with triumph. With a quiet sadness, the kind that does not need words to be understood. The judge called for order. Then, with the even voice of someone who had already reached her conclusion before announcing it, she stated that the evidence presented by the defense not only invalidated the accusation, but also indicated the concrete possibility of a criminal act of false accusation, with authorship to be investigated. The gavel struck. Renato closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, the three were standing. No one ran. No one shouted. When the gavel struck and the judge ended the session, the room took a moment to move, the way it happens after anything intense, when the body still has not processed that it is over. Renato remained seated, his hands resting on the table, staring at a fixed point ahead. Dr. Isabella organized the papers with the same calm as always. And the three stood still, waiting. It was Tiago who moved first. He walked around the wooden divider separating the audience from the party's area, placed a hand on Renato's shoulder, and said nothing. He did not need to. Davi came right after, with that restrained manner that belonged only to him. He stood beside him, lightly touched his arm against his father's, and stayed quiet too. Bruno was the last. He stood for a second at the entrance to the divider, chin raised the way he always did, and then walked to Renato and hugged him with a force that had nothing performative about it. Renato took a few seconds to raise his arms. When he did not let go anymore. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining hard for an April morning. Cascavel had that habit. The weather changed quickly, and sometimes the sun appeared right after heavy rain as if it had no idea what had happened before. The four stood on the sidewalk for a while, in no hurry to go anywhere. Gilberto had left through a side door, even before the formal closing. The lawyer followed after him. Neither of them looked back. Renato saw them leave from a distance. "Are you angry?" Bruno asked, following his father's gaze. Renato truly thought before answering. He was not the kind of man who said what he thought should be said. "I feel sorry for him," he finally replied. "Pity is worse than anger, in a way. Anger passes." No one added anything, because there was nothing to add. In the months that followed, the investigation into the false accusation moved forward. Gilberto's nephew reached an agreement with the public prosecutor's office before the case went to trial. Gilberto was indicted as the mastermind, and although the process was still ongoing, the evidence gathered by Davi, Tiago, and Bruno formed a foundation investigators described, in an official document, as exceptionally solid for an inquiry conducted by people without police training. Meanwhile, the land remained frozen by court order during the investigation. Renato's plan, to transform the shed into a space for vulnerable young people, remained on paper waiting. But only for now. It was Davi who had the idea. During a call with his brothers, 3 weeks after the hearing, he proposed that the three of them take on the renovation of the shed with their own resources, regardless of the legal outcome involving the property. If the land returned to Renato, they would have accelerated the process. If it did not, at least they would have done what they could with what they had. Tiago calculated the costs one afternoon. Bruno started calling suppliers the following week. Davi handled the paperwork to turn the space into a non-profit association. Renato discovered what they were doing when Tiago showed up at the repair shop one Saturday morning carrying a blueprint under his arm. "What's this?" Renato asked. "The shed. We already have a renovation estimate." Renato stared at the blueprint for a long moment. Then he looked at Tiago. "This is going to cost you a lot." "It cost you a lot too," Tiago replied. "For about 22 years. The renovation took 4 months. On a Friday in August, the shed opened its doors for the first time. No big celebration, no prepared speech, no banner with a fancy name. Just open doors and a simple wooden sign that Bruno had made with his own hands, sanded and painted one afternoon. The sign read, "Open House," because someone had to. It was Renato's phrase. The same one he had said decades earlier, when someone in the neighborhood asked why he had taken in 3 children nobody wanted. None of the 3 needed to discuss it. Each had reached the same conclusion alone, and when Bruno showed up with a finished sign, Davi and Tiago recognized the words without needing to ask where they came from. Renato stood in front of the sign for a while. Then he walked inside, because there was work to do. There is an idea people repeat so often that it has lost its real strength, that love is proven through words. But Renato Caldas was never a man of many words. He proved what he felt by waking up early, making meals, fixing faucets, borrowing books from the library for a child who barely spoke. Day after day, without an audience, without recognition, without certainty that it was worth it. And 22 years later, 3 grown men showed up in a courtroom carrying folders full of evidence, a witness no one expected, and the calm determination of people who had been taught, without words, that when someone you love is in trouble, you do not ask whether you should help. You simply go. That is the part no accusation, no lawyer, and no scheme can fake. What was truly built with time and presence does not collapse when someone tries to tear it down. It endures. And sometimes, it endures in a way that surprises even the person who built it. Renato did not save 3 boys nobody wanted. He found 3 people the world had discarded and treated each of them exactly as they were, someone who deserved to be there. The rest came naturally. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you thought and which city or country you are watching from. It makes all the difference in helping stories like this reach even more people.